Good morning and welcome to Virtual Sunday School with Morrilton First Presbyterian Church. I'm Pastor Ainsley, and this morning we'll be continuing our study, Faces of Faith from Sanctified Art. Today we will be looking at the book of Esther, but we will not be talking about Esther today. We're instead going to be talking about a character in the story who doesn't get quite as much attention. Her name is Vashti. You might have heard that name before. So I invite you to turn to Esther 1. We're going to be looking at the beginning of the story. So if you're not familiar with the setting of the book of Esther, this happens while the people of Judah are in exile. So they were exiled, taken away by the Babylonians, and then Persia conquered Babylon. So this happens in Persia with a group of Jews who are in that empire. So the story begins by talking about King Ahasuerus, who was the emperor of Persia at the time. And it begins by telling us that he was having a huge banquet to celebrate just how wonderful his kingdom was and how wealthy he was and how prosperous. So he's having this banquet, and then his wife is Queen Vashti. So that is before Esther. He was married to Vashti. And so while the king is having a banquet, she is having a banquet as well for the women of the palace. So we're going to be starting in chapter 1, verse 10. So let's read the story here. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended him, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. At this the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages who knew the laws, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and custom, and those next to him were Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 officials of Persia and Media who had access to the king and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, "Not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come.' This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti has never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike." This advice pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master of his own house. So Vashti is a woman in the Bible who often gets overlooked for another woman in the Bible, something that doesn't happen very often. Often we overlook the women in favor of the stories of the men. But we overlook what she did because of the story of Esther. Obviously, the book is named after Esther. Esther is the Jewish woman. Vashti is not Jewish. She is Persian. And so she gets overlooked in favor of Esther. But the thing is that her story is just as important to the narrative of Esther because it sets up what happens later in the book. So if it weren't for what Vashti did, what happens with Esther later would never be able to happen. So Vashti is a woman who is very brave because she knows what the consequences are. Later on, we learn that disobeying the king can mean that you get put to death. So what Vashti is risking here isn't just banishment, which is what happens. She's actually risking death by disobeying the king. But the thing is that she did it because she saw the king's request as wrong. And it's a little confusing because we might look at this and say he just wanted her to come out in front of his friends so they could see her. Why is that wrong? Well, there's a lot of debate about exactly what the king was asking her to do. There's some scholars who believe that he was actually asking her to come out in front of his friends wearing nothing but her crown. So that definitely changes the request. But also we have to remember that the men who were with the king, they've been drinking for 7 days straight. And so he's asking her to come and parade herself, whether clothed or not, in front of a group of very drunken men. The chances are that she would be assaulted probably if she came out. She could get hurt because the men are drunk and they see her as property, and the king obviously sees her as nothing but property. He does not really, we think of a queen as being someone with authority, but really she was just, the property of the king, and there wasn't really much respect for her beyond, look at this beautiful woman who I own. And so she sees that request as wrong, that she's not just a beautiful woman to be owned and paraded in front of a bunch of drunken men, but she's actually a person, and that she deserves respect just like any other woman. And so she refuses, and this refusal is seen as a threat by the rest of the leaders, that they say that if the other women of Persia hear about what Vashti did, then they will look on their husbands with contempt, and they will not listen to them. They will do whatever they want, just like Vashti did. And so that's why the officials recommend that Vashti be banished from the presence of the king. And it's likely, we think that what he's saying is she's like cast out of the palace, but the way it's phrased here, that she will never be allowed to come before the king again. We have to remember that at that time the king would have had an entire harem full of women, and so she probably spent the rest of her life in the harem in the palace, because the king wouldn't want her to go out and be with any other man, so she probably just spent the rest of her life in the palace, just banished from the presence of the king. But the officials, they don't just recommend that she be banished from his presence, but also the king ends up making a decree that every man should be master in his own house. And I find this decree a little bit funny because this is a patriarchal society. where this is already true. Women are only seen as property, as I've already said, so men are already the master of their own house. So it's kind of funny. The book of Esther often uh, paints the king in a really bad light, kind of this hilarious depiction of him as this incompetent man who cannot even get his own wife to do what he wants, who is manipulated by the people around him. And so it's just this funny decree that he makes, just as a way of showing how incompetent and ridiculous this king is, because of course this was written by Jews who did not like the Persians, and who wanted to make the king of the Persians look bad. So the irony of this story then is that after the king banishes Vashti from his presence, he goes out and he finds a new queen, Esther, of course. This is where Esther's story begins in chapter 2. And so the idea is he's looking for a new wife who will be more obedient to him and do whatever he wants. And ultimately, she ends up being another very strong woman who goes to him when she isn't called, which again is risking death. You're only supposed to go to the king if you are invited. But she goes to him anyways. She reveals the plot of one of the king's officials who's trying to kill her people. She gets the king to reverse his decision and to save all of her people, the Jews. And so it's just ironic that he gets rid of this woman for being too strong and being a threat to his power, and he ends up with a woman, a new wife, who also ends up manipulating him and overriding his decisions. So it's just a very ironic twist to the story. So ultimately what happens here is Vashti paves the way for Esther to do what she has to do. Because if Vashti had obeyed the king, then she would have remained in her position. The king never would have gone out looking for a new queen, and Esther never would have ended up where she was. And then ultimately, when Haman makes the plot to kill all of the Jews, then Esther wouldn't have been in that position to save them. So Vashti makes it possible for Esther to do what she needs to do. And what I love about Vashti is that she is willing to sacrifice everything to stand up against something that she believed to be wrong. And so it's the same thing that Esther does. It's just on a much smaller scale. So Vashti is standing up for herself and for her own dignity, and Esther is standing up for her people. And so I think that she's a woman who's to be admired just as much as Esther was. So the question that this story leaves us with is, how can we be like both Vashti and Esther? How can we stand up against people who abuse their power? How can we stand up for what we believe is right, and say, what you're doing is wrong, and I won't go along with it. I won't allow you to continue doing this. So how can we learn from their example and do that in our own lives, in our own communities, our own country, our own world? And how can we stand up for what is right? So let's say a prayer before we go. Holy God, today we remember the example of Esther and Vashti, and we lift up to you all those who have been cast out or abused or harmed. And we lift up to you also those who stand up for what is right. who stand up against abuse and abuse of power. And we ask that you strengthen them and that you show us how we too can do the same. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.